Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to another edition of Community Talk. A new season, a new start. I'm joined in the studio by my new co-host, Martin Singh, who's well familiar to those Sangat in the GTA area. And we'll hopefully share some ideas. We want to hear your ideas, and we want to hear some of your views on some of the topics that we discuss, and would like your input into ideas for new topics.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Paji, thank you for having me here. And if I could just add to that, on the topics that we'll be chatting about on this season, I don't think either one of us would claim to be experts necessarily, but our job and our role here is really to start and generate a discussion. And that's why we look forward to getting feedback from the community by way of email, or for those of us out in the GTA, the Greater Toronto area that have our phone numbers here, you're more than welcome to give us a call, and it would be our pleasure to hear from you.
The topic we have today, is something that you brought up to me a couple of weeks back, actually, when we were having a chat, and it actually stimulated a thought in my mind. Mm-hmm. Is your child a Granthi or not? Mm-hmm. Now, would you want your child to be a Granthi? I mean, how did that come about for you?
Well, so for me, it was always fascinating. So as some folks may be aware, I'm born and brought up in a different faith background. I was born and brought up as Christian. And we know from our history that, for example, with Catholics, many Catholic families, at least here in North America, particularly among the French Catholics, would often raise one of their children to become a priest. Now, it wasn't always the case that they became a priest, but often, that particular path or goal was followed by the family. And in addition to that, there were some Protestant families that did that as well. So with my own father, for example, who grew up as an altar boy in St. George's, which is the Round Church, Church of England, Anglican, in Halifax, so too was this true of him. He was an altar boy for all his years. And then when he finally finished high school, his parents sent him off to the Atlantic School of Theology to see if he was interested in becoming a minister. Now, he decided not to, and that's fine. And, he went on and did other things. But this just got me to thinking. And so what it is, I see a very interesting contrast that happens in our community with respect to this issue. So let's say, for example, we took a group of, say, 1,000 Sikh people who self-declared themselves as, following the faith or being religious. And we asked them the question, would you be proud, or would you be happy if one of your children, son or daughter, was able to, memorize, say, a Japji Sahib? And I would say the overwhelming majority would put their hand up and say yes. Similarly, if we asked them the question, would you be happy if one of your children learned, Kirtan, right? Mm-hmm. Similar too, I think that the overwhelming majority would say yes. And also too, I would say that, if you ask them if, one of their children learned very well how to interpret a particular passage in the Guru Nanak Devji, would they be proud of that as well? And I would argue, the answer would be yes again. And so we have this consistent positive response that's coming when people are being asked questions about their children in terms of knowledge of the faith, background, learning, interpretation, and whatnot. But by contrast, if you ask that same group of people, would they be interested in their son or daughter becoming a Granthi, I dare say there'd be very few to no hands go up.
But do you think, if we take a look at Guru Nanak Devji during his period, and what his view was of the clergy of the time, that they were in hand in glove with those who were oppressing. Mm-hmm. Does that, so Guru Nanak Devji, in his thought, established that the clergy was hand in glove with those or instruments of oppression. Mm-hmm. Do you think that still holds today? And that view sort of permeates today?
Before we get to your question, I think it's important that we draw a distinction between clergy that exists in other faiths, because that's what Guru Nanak Devji would be looking at, and how the clergy or so-called clergy exists for us in Sikhism. So as an example, when we look at, say, Christian faiths, the priest is seen to be in an elevated position spiritually. If we take that to the next step, you have bishops, cardinals, which are viewed as the princes of the church. And then, in fact, if you talk about the Pope's other name, would be the vicar of Christ, and so there's a spiritual elevation that happens there. And in fact, I think it's the case. All of the past popes have been sainted. I mean, I don't want to speak out of turn on that, but that gives you an idea of how that works. You know, in one of the other faiths, at least for us, at least we're not supposed to have that same particular, how shall I say, stratification that exists between the Sanghat and someone who preaches the faith or educates the masses on the faith. Now, there is confusion that exists around that because we know that Granthi, when it's translated from Punjabi into English in English newspapers, is translated as the word priest. But I'm not so sure that that's the best translation that can happen. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is Guru Nanak Devji, drawing, a parallel in terms of the power structure between that group of clergy that self-identifies as being different on a spiritual level than the Sanghat as a whole? Or is he drawing a parallel between clergy in general and the power structures that exist in society? And I'm not so sure which one is the case.
So why do we not want our children to be Granthis? Is there any particular reason for that?
Yeah, this is a hard one. I mean, I can share with you a personal story. I mean, I mentioned to you my background and whatnot. When I got, I mean, for me and my Sikhism, I kind of learned about my Sikhi in the absence of a community, meaning that I lived in Nova Scotia. There's only one gurdwara there. There's only about 100, 150 families, and I even lived apart from that because I lived in rural Nova Scotia. So when I went to India and got married, my thinking, I was like, geez, I'd love for one of my children to become a Granthi, And so then, we got married, and we're talking about the future, having children and whatnot. And I mentioned it to my wife, and she almost choked, And then I was like, wow, what did I step into here? And so what it is that at least culturally, it's not seen, as being a worthy occupation. I mean, we know from our community. I mean, folks talk about being a doctor, they talk about being an engineer, they talk about being a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these are your top three that come up. Granthi, you never hear it talked about, and I am not so sure what the reasoning is. I mean, one of the reasoning is people may believe, rightly or wrongly, that you can't earn a living off of it because they're not paid well. But that's a challenge also, and I'm sure you're aware that it's written right into our scripture, that you shouldn't be making money, question mark about the amount, but you shouldn't be making money off the faith necessarily. And I'd be interested in hearing your views on that.
But I mean, let's take a look at some historical backgrounds, especially, for example, those Kirtanias who come from Bhai Mardana's background, who served the Guru's courts. Mm-hmm. Now, my understanding was that they've been rewarded handsomely by the Sikh Gurus. They were extremely skilled musicians. Bhai Mardana's even been thought to be one of the Gurus of Tansen, who's obviously one of the famous classical musicians. So, whereas the Sikh sort of thoughts on the music, especially this Gurmat Sangeet, those who practice Gurmat Sangeet were actually rewarded handsomely in the Guru's Darbar. Those who the poets of the Guru's Darbar were rewarded handsomely. So, if from a historical perspective, there seems to be a tradition of actually rewarding this. Now, there's on the flip side. There'll be many in our Sangha who, and many of our viewers who are watching, who will be saying, "Well, no, this is not for monetary reward."
That's right.
Right. But then, how does the family survive? If as a religion, we have a tradition of a Granthi or a tradition of a Ragi Singhs or Ragi Jathas, not necessarily a male, but even female, then they're not told to be celibate. I mean, this is a discussion that we had a few weeks ago.
Sure.
They're not told to be celibate. They're told to be actually encouraged to be household family owners, and then they want their children to go to university. They want their children to go to, and become professionals and have a home and live the life that everyone else does.
Correct.
How is that done without money?
Yeah, and that's just it. And here is where we could start to draw a distinction, right? And this is different from all different faiths. So, for example, drawing back to Roman Catholics, we mentioned celibacy. They have that as a rule. Interestingly enough, it wasn't always a rule. There used to be a time when Catholic priests used to be able to get married, but it hasn't been for quite so many years now. But then you have the religious leaders like rabbis and whatnot in other faiths who do get paid, and some of them do get paid very, very well. And as a result of that, as a result of paying them very, very well, you also attract highly intelligent and highly skilled people into the roles. And so what happens then is that you're able to establish a career, as, I mean, I say Granthi in our case, but say a career as a preacher, for lack of a better term, for applying it to all faiths, whereby they are able to not just serve as a reader, but also to provide direction and leadership to the entire community, which is really what we're looking for.
But our Granthis and our Pracharaks, they have to be mindful of what the committee's views are. They gotta, when they speak from the stage, they don't necessarily. I mean, I was listening to one piece that they're not necessarily promoting the faith. Mm-hmm. Right, sometimes they're promoting the committee that's actually, they're actually in service. He who pays the fiddler calls the tune, as it were.
That's right.
Right, and they tend to be in service of those committees, of those sangats, and they're not necessarily actually promoting the faith. They're probably sometimes promoting stuff that may not even concur with Sikh thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and quite right you are. I mean, the other the other expression that we use for that, he who has the gold makes the rules, right? Yeah. And so, in addressing this challenge, in fact, now we have, we've identified it's not just a singular challenge; it's a twofold challenge, meaning that the one challenge is that we want to make sure that our faith remains strong. We want to make sure that the faith serves the community's needs currently and also as they change and evolve. But at the same time, how do we draw in the expertise and the human resources to make that happen without the money, first of all? And then if the money's there, what are the strings attached?
Yes, and not just the strings attached. I was thinking, how do you evaluate what a preacher is worth, what the Pracharak is worth? I mean, well, what's the job evaluation mechanism, as it were?
That's it.
Right. And I think that there may be some weaknesses in that as well, because say the Sangat in a particular area is working class and not are able to afford a lot, then they obviously won't be able to pay as much either for those services. So wouldn't it actually sort of stratify our religious sort of preaching, for those in the poorer areas or lower socioeconomic groups? Wouldn't they be getting less of a preaching service than those who are from more affluent backgrounds or more affluent areas?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and you talk about it from a socioeconomic perspective. Let's just talk from a pure population perspective. If you have a community that has 100,000 families, they're going to have a larger capacity no matter what the socioeconomic status is than those communities that, for example, only have 100 families. And so you may, in fact, I mean, and this is true where I grew up in Halifax, there is no, Granthi or Ragge.
So let's just explore that a second. How did you, in Halifax, where there's 100 families?
I think through the province there's about 150 families.
150 families throughout the province and one gurdwara.
Yeah.
And how did you do those services, as it were?
So the way it was run in Halifax, in fact, is that, first of all, your gurdwara is not open 24/7. It's mostly open on a regular basis on Sundays because folks are off. And what would happen is that you would quite simply have members of the Sangat who would perform the various services, whether that's singing or playing the bhaja, whatever the case may be. And so, I mean, there's a heartwarming feeling to that people from the community itself stand up and do that particular service. The challenge that you have, though, is that there is a core base of skills that you need in order to be able to make that happen. I mean, one of the challenges that they face there is when they do the full reading, like for say in a Kanth Pol, the full reading through the Guru Nanak Devji, they might quite simply not have enough people to do the full reading for 24 hours from, when it starts on the Friday to when it ends on the Sunday at around noon hour. And so it presents its own challenges there as well.
Then the role of a Granthi, I mean, changes for different places, different. So in say Toronto, where there's many Sangat, the role of Granthi would not necessarily, but it has become, though, because of the commercialization, I think, of the gurdwara, and maybe a separate topic that we talk about. But
yes,
the Granthi is the one who does the part, right? And the Sangat doesn't do the part.
Correct.
right? That represents its own weaknesses, right? And whereas you don't get the community involvement, and so it's a disengagement, and then you do establish a priestly class, right? Now, and
at least from an administrative level.
Yes, and at least from an administrative level. But now let's just explore the priestly class as it relates to Punjab, right, where you have the Akal Takht Jathedar, right? You know, sometimes you read in the media, oh, who is the Akal Takht Jathedar, and they will equate it to the Pope. But that doesn't follow in our faith, does it?
Not from a religious perspective, no. Like, I mean, if you were to take, at least my interpretation, and so our viewers at home may have a different take on this, and we'd love to hear from you if that's the case. But what it is that, you know, we don't see that person as the vicar of Guru Nanak Devji, as an example, right? Like, we don't put them on that kind of a pedestal. We don't see them as having the same divine light. There's an understanding that when Guru Gobind Singh, you know, put in place, you know, the everlasting, ever-living Guru and the Guru Granthi, that was it from that particular line. And I think that's well accepted and well understood. But there is certainly a power base that might exist, you know, with that particular position that is similar to the Pope, at least as far as Sikhism is concerned.
Now, for those who are thinking, some of our viewers at home about what training mechanisms would there be to actually be a Granthi? I mean, there are some seminary schools in Punjab, but none of them cater to the UK market or the Canadian market. Well, not market, but the Sangat, I think is the correct term.
Sure.
So none of them Canadian to the NRI Sangat. I mean, I sometimes read from time to time, there's a whole thing that we should try to generate our own Granthis in North America or in Europe. What's your view on that?
I think that, well, first of all, whether we decide it's possible or not, you and I both know that Sangat has the power to do so if they want to do it. Meaning that if you had a young boy or girl who wanted, for example, to study, you know, a master's degree in religious studies or that type of thing, you know, that they would be able to do that. What's even more interesting, though, is what education do we want our Granthi to have? Certainly, you'd want them to be well versed in Sikhi, but is the only service that they are to provide through the gurdwara to be, you know, well read in the Guru Granth Sahib Ji? And I'm not so sure that that's the case. As an example. Again, stepping back to the Catholic faith, you know, they have the confessional, right, whereby people from the congregation can come in, speak to their priest in a private manner about their issues and get advice. You know, is there a role that's not being filled here that should be filled? Certainly, we have, you know, in society for those people who have difficulty feeding themselves, we have the langar halls. But I think that there is a distinct need for someone with a strong social worker background to help facilitate discussions between various groups of populations inside Sikhism, meaning that the difference between the parents and the children, where the parents were born and raised in India, the children are born and raised here, trying to facilitate those cultural differences that exist there, or, you know, helping people with, you know, helping those couples that have marital difficulties or that type of thing. I think that there's a distinct role that the gurdwara and that you know, a Granthi who's educated and whatnot here in North America could fill in those particular cases. So is there a religious aspect to be filled? There is no question. Do they have the power to do it? Absolutely. If they want to put the money behind it, it will happen. But is it only that we're looking for, or is there another skill set that we think would be particularly useful?
I think on that note, it's time's up for this week. This has been a very interesting discussion, and it's been insightful to hear from yourself, especially about some of the other faiths and backgrounds. And I do foresee a time that, say, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, that there will be this development that does take place as the faith evolves, where the highly skilled, professional, well-grounded Granthi is the way of the future. On that note, we will see you next time.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.